Good evening. I'm Roxana Markoc, Senior Curator of Photography, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this forum on contemporary photography organized in conjunction with the Stephen Shore retrospective here at the Museum of Modern Art, covering 5 decades of the artist's work. And in fact, I hope you had the chance, some of you, to see it. We had a 1 hour where you could preview the exhibition. If not, please come. It will be on view for 5 months here. And the exhibition has been organized by Quentin Bajac, who is the Joel and Anne Ehrenkranz Chief Curator of Photography, with Kristen Gaylor. Kristen, are you around? She's right here, and Kristen is the Beaumont and Nancy Newhall Curatorial Fellow. The exhibition is accompanied by a unique encyclopedia-style catalog comprising some 60 sections, each section prefaced by a concise and illuminating essay, authored by Quentin, with additional contributions by Kristen, who in fact also wrote an incredibly interesting and painstakingly detailed chronology, and also with additional essays by the film and photography scholar David Campany and by Martino Stierli, who is our Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design. Now, a limited number of these catalogs signed by Stephen are in fact available tonight only, right here at the forum, outside of this room. So after the forum, for those of you who are interested in acquiring one, please do so. Stephen is well known for his very intense looking and truly for his relentless, examinations of the possibilities of photography, from the medium's conceptual underpinnings, I would say, to its popular idioms. And he has worked both in black and white and has pioneered American color photography. And if you go through the show, you will see how many times it has changed, moving from multi-part serial works to kind of diaristic snapshots and travelogue type postcards to large format camera pictures, and of course to more recently digital as well as new social media platforms. And at the age of 6, given his interest in chemistry, he began developing negatives after receiving Kodak darkroom equipment. At the age of 9, he was experimenting with his first 35mm camera. And by the time he was 14, in 1962, he managed somehow to secure a meeting with Edward Steichen, who at the time was the director of the photography department here at MoMA, who after that meeting acquired 3 of his black and white photographs for the museum's collection. Then in the mid-60s, Stephen dropped out of high school to pursue a 3-year project, which was photographing Andy Warhol's studio, known as the Factory. And of course, the many protagonists were in and out at the time, including people such as Nico and members of the Velvet Underground and Eddie Sedgwick and Warhol himself. He has met, in fact, Warhol that year at the Filmmaker Cinematheque, which was run by the filmmaker and critic Jonas Mekas, when both Andy and Stephen were presenting their films there. And the film that Stephen was presenting was a short called Elevator, which for the very first time now you can see in its restored form here within the exhibition. And then in 1971, Stephen became, at the age of 24, the first living photographer to have a one-person exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, ever since Alfred Stieglitz had his own, I think 40 years earlier. And then 6 years later, in 1975, he had his first solo exhibition here at MoMA. So a profoundly influential photographer, Stephen is also known as a true mentor to many students, and he has been directing the photography program at Bard College. And I think that one of my, I would say, the citations from Stephen that I love so much, in fact, pertains to the idea of teaching and to the idea of both affective but also intellectual intersubjectivity. And I'm going to quote him. So he says that my goal as a teacher is to help my students find their own voice. And so if I have 10 people in a class, it means I have to think like 10 different people. And that has proven to be an interesting mental exercise, because then when I go out to take pictures, it's like I've been flexing my aesthetic faculty, and I simply see more potential or see more opportunities, and wind up following, taking pictures that don't look like my pictures. This whole process, this whole endeavor of teaching has kind of pushed my own boundaries. And with, in fact, that assertion in mind, I was interested in convoking tonight a group of artists, quite different in their approaches, who have studied with Stephen. And Lucas Blalock, who's very seemingly deadpan pictures. Sometimes your own pictures have been called deadpan, but certainly yours are. As well as kind of Brechtian method of exposing those photographic conventions have, so to speak, broken that fourth wall of picture making. Tim Davis, whose very creative photographic output often dwells on the social documentary, and whose writings on various cultural issues, but especially on Stephen's own practice, I found truly revelatory. And Shannon Ebner, whose both photographic and phonographic work, I would say, explores those correlations between images and language, experimental language, poetry, political speech. And Xaviera Simmons, whose interdisciplinary practice often questions issues of identity, but also memory and experience by tapping on, well, I would say both her own materials, but also historical, collections. And I know that this is just scratching the surface of what you are all doing, and we'll be hearing from all of you, and you'll share your insights about your practices and Stephen's pedagogy. But before we do that, I would like to give the word to Quentin to say a few words.
Thank you, Roxana. Does this work? Yes, this works. So it's true that seeing 4 former students around Stephen here in this room, this is not a trap. This is not a kind of gestalt group therapy about your undergrad years at Bard College. This is not what we intended to do. Maybe it will turn out to be that, but that was not our initial intention when we decided to invite you all. So you're not only former students, but you're also all teaching. So that's also quality of teacher, educators, lecturers that we invited you, and I think that's important. But let's move on and start with Stephen, and let's start with that image. Let's by a few facts before starting the conversation and turning the microphone. I need my glasses because as years go by, I have the feeling that the light gets dimmer, but it's not. It's my eyesight. So, since 1982, Stephen has directed the photography program at Bard College in Annandale-on-Hudson, which is north of New York City. A program that he deliberately oriented toward straight photography, at a time when most photography teachers were emphasizing manipulated and constructed photography. I shall come back to that image, which is fascinating, but let's move first to this teaching experience, and more particularly his reflection on one of his courses called Photographic Seeing, was the basis of The Nature of Photographs, which is the book, Stephen, that you published in 1998. So, and this may seem an unlikely situation for a photographer who left school at 17, and who was completely self-taught in his craft, apart from a few early tutoring and workshop with Minor White in 70.
If I had stayed at school, I might have longer text in the book.
So this is something that maybe we would like to hear from you, Stephen, knowing how this situation today is different from that of the late 60s, and when you were in age of becoming a photo student, and how all you envisioned that evolution. So I was reading this morning on a website, the RT website, an article that was just published about you, written by a journalist, Scott Indrisek, who obviously interviewed you not that long ago. And the journalist writes, and I quote him, "Despite being a proponent of the latest image technologies, Shaw is something of a purist when it comes to counseling those who are just starting their careers, like the students attending the photography department at Bard College, where he is the director. There, he tells me, the first 2 years are spent fully immersed in analog photography." End of quote. So I do not know if that is perfectly accurate, but we'll see. Nonetheless, it seems to me that your teaching, Stephen, continues indeed to be sustained by ideas closely tied, of course, to your own practice, such as the use of film and analog camera. That you see this type of training as an indispensable prerequisite to understanding certain essential aspects of photography, so the discipline of shooting, but particularly with a view camera, printing photographs, of course, in the darkroom, and using both black and white and color. So I will be also interested in a way, hearing about your evolution as a teacher, because in fact, the Stephen Shaw that was teaching in the mid-80s is probably not the same one, and not teaching in the same way as the teacher that is teaching today. I would say, and maybe in fact you will all contradict me here, that Stephen sees his role as a teacher as guiding students to their own path, a path that may ultimately diverge from the precept of straight photography. They are taught initially, and in fact, when I have a look at all your works, I can hardly describe them as a straight photographic practice, so you seem to me to be perfect illustration of that precept. So now let me go back quickly to that image, which is one of the ephemera that is presented downstairs in the exhibition galleries as part of Stephen's slide timeline. So this is a spread from a Japanese edition of Esquire magazine. It was published in the April 2009 issue. So the bubble above Stephen's head reads, "The good thing about Bard is that students get to study liberal arts in an art school-like environment." End of the. Though I admit it's not, of course, a masterworks of photography, it's an image which is full of information, maybe in fact faked information, but I find it personally quite fascinating, and I would like to try to take it seriously for 2 minutes. Because it conveys, I think, a certain number of messages. First message, this is a photography program deeply rooted in photography's long history and tradition. You will note the 19th century prints on the wall, but it's also open to modern photography, as suggested by the Vinogrand photo, which is projected, which is an image, Stephen, that you included in your 1998 book, Nature of Photographs, that I mentioned earlier. I would also add to this that the technological devices that you see that are dispersed in the class reinforce that idea of a pedagogy that would be a kind of perfect balance between the modernity and tradition. Second information or second message, the whole thing looks rather informal. So a small group, no real distance between the students and the teacher, and the teacher is dressed casual, both elegant and relaxed. It seems that you're wearing a jacket and a jean. So it's definitely not what I would call an authoritarian relationship between a teacher and his students, and it is illustrating more, I would say, a kind of tutoring in a conversational mode. So a discussion between equals. So this is something I would relate to an idea that you often expressed, which is that the student-teacher relationship is a relationship characterized by mutual enrichment rather than a unilateral apprenticeship where the students learns from the master. So a teaching process that you describe, and I quote you, truly altruistic and truly selfish without contradiction. So this is also something that I would like to hear you about, because I think that in a way your practice, embracing new techniques, has been nurtured a lot by your exchanges with your students all over the years. So third message, the bubble above Stephen said, so I come back to it. That is something I think very important for you, Stephen, that the program at Bard provides a general, I mean technical, historical and aesthetic framework, but within the context of a broad-based liberal arts college. So this is not an art school. You're not training only arts photographers to be artists, and this is also something we can discuss because you all have teaching experience in art schools, some of you, which is probably different from a liberal arts college. And then the fourth message, which is in fact conveyed by the Planisphere, which is in the background, which suggests, I think, that is a program which is international, open to the world, and probably open to students from all over the world, something that of course makes sense in a Japanese magazine for Japanese readers and viewers. And that brings me also a question that maybe we can discuss if we have time, that is the internationalization of the students, and more broadly, what is the evolution of the students today, in what terms the students are different today than they were 15 or 20 years ago. Those that have maybe a longer experience or perspective with teaching, Tim especially and Shannon, can maybe try to answer that question. So that was just a few points, path for a discussion to come. Next, Roxana is?
Well, actually next, I just want to say one thing about, some of you may know that Anne Lay was supposed to be here and she regrets that she couldn't because this is what happens sometimes. An assignment comes and she needed to be out of town today. But yesterday when she was here, I did ask her, in fact, what she found, you know, like it was the most poignant experience for her. And then she just said that, and I jotted down because I thought her voice should be heard. And she said, Stephen is a man of few words, but everything he says carries incredible weight. And with that Anne quote, I would like to ask Xaviera, actually, who studied both with Stephen and with Anne, to take the lead.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Can you guys say hi back so I can? Thank you. Okay, this is fabulous. I'm probably going to be more than 4 minutes. I want to start by saying I think I gave you a little eye roll, but that's just because I don't have actually an issue with identity at all, and I feel this, I guess as an African-American descendant of slaves, I feel this wash come over me every time someone says that. I get like a little hot in the face because I'm like, I don't have that issue, you know, it's something else. So which we should probably have another forum about. But I don't have and so my work doesn't really revolve around issues of identity, actually. I have an issue with the country and the politics here and the history, but I don't have an issue with my own identity, and I don't usually think about that in my work, so I just, out of respect and love for you. So focusing on Stephen, I was always very intimidated by Stephen. I think I still am. I kind of shied away from taking his class. I actually studied mostly with Anne, Larry Fink, Luc Sant, and Laurie Dahlberg, who's the art history professor at Bard. But I will say, I mean, Stephen is the overarching theme of Bard College, the Woods photography department, and he was always around, and I was always really nervous to be around him, as I am right now, actually, which is fine. And I know it's peculiar, but it's true. But I remember I came to Bard after taking many years off. I used to be a photographer's assistant for Walter Chin, who's a fashion photographer. And I came to Bard after spending 2 years walking with monks. And so I was a bit older than most of the other students. But I had to go to Bard. Like, I knew that it was the space for me, and I knew that I wanted to study under Stephen. It was like, it was just basic, common, like, you want to be a photographer, you study with the best. Who's the best? Stephen. And I always knew that. And so my first copy of The Nature of Photographs, I kind of like caressed and read many times before I ever met Stephen, when I was living in Amherst after traveling with those monks. And so text and image is something that has always been really important to me, and it was really kind of expanded by reading The Nature of Photographs. So I just want to read one section. Photography and image and text is something that I always work through in my own practice. He says, this book explores ways of understanding the nature of photographs, that is, how photographs function, and not only the most elegant or graceful photographs, but all photographs made with a camera and printed directly from the negative or digital file. All photographic prints have qualities in common. These qualities determine how the world in front of the camera is transformed into a photograph. They also form the visual grammar that elucidates the photograph's meaning. And I think Stephen and the team that he has at Bard kind of really helps you, at least what I found through studying there, it helps you to kind of open up that language. Really, it's basically like you're inside of the book as you're working with the professors or the teachers at Bard. As I said, I spent a lot of time with Anmi Lee, who's basically, I guess, Stephen's, how would you describe Anmi?
Well, now that Larry has partially retired, she would be, I guess, my senior colleague.
Yeah, she would be, and I feel like I remember when Anmi, because I started when Anmi started, I believe, and I used to take classes with Larry, who's, if you guys all know Larry Fink, he's like this, like loud, like intense, and then Anmi is like super, and she's very much like Stephen, actually, quite stoic, kind of, and intimidating, but also a master crafts person. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand how to be a better craftsperson in relationship to these masters that I was around. And I'm really thankful to Anmi because she helped me to understand how to create characters inside of landscapes and how to think about landscapes in more complicated ways. And so for me, I've put a lot of thought into American history in particular and in its relationship to photography and art history. And I really want to go back to Stephen again because the team that Stephen assembles around the photography department is pretty rigorous. They're very intellectually, what's the word? Challenging is the word, and super, super smart, and provide you with so much knowledge as a student so that you can really make photographs that not only are crafted well with that 4x5 camera, which you stumble upon at first and then you kind of try to master, but then you know, they're imbued with both this liberal arts kind of dialogue that's happening interdepartmentally and also this rigor with the camera and the photography department, which is quite small. I really love the first edition of this book, which was a copy of Dieter Appel's So this is the first edition. This is Dieter Appelt's photograph. But then I also love this Ken Josephson photograph, which is actually the cover of this is this the second edition,
Yeah.
Stephen? This is the second edition. So I really love and appreciate this image as well, and I've actually been in conversation with this image. And so I think, again, studying in the department with Anmi and with Stephen, you really understand the historical relevance, kind of working within the tradition of photography and the historical relevance of the past, and then trying to situate yourself within the present. Text, for me, text and photography go hand in hand, and I wanted to read a section from a book by Toni Morrison titled The Origin of Others. And she says, "The resources available to us for benign access to each other, for vaulting the mere blue air that separates us, are few but powerful: language, image, and experience, which may involve both, one or neither of the first two. Language, saying, listening, reading, can encourage, even mandate, surrender the breach of distance among us. Whether they are continental or on the same pillow, whether they are distances of culture or the distinctions and indistinctions of age or gender, whether they are consequences of social invention or biology. Image increasingly rules the realm of shaping, sometimes becoming, often contaminating knowledge. Provoking language or eclipsing it, an image can determine not only what we know and feel, but also what we believe is worth knowing about what we feel." So this is a work that I just produced where I'm thinking a lot about, whereas before I was thinking a lot about landscape and the characters that I felt were missing inside of images. And I really started making this type of work. This is a work that I produced while I was studying at Bard. And in my own quiet way, I was kind of actually rebelling against a lot of the structure at Bard because I felt very singular. I was actually the only African American in the department at that time, so I felt very singular in the conversation, but I also felt very incorporated into the rigor of the department. And I make large-scale text work, so I always think a lot about Stephen's work, like this photograph, and many, many other photographs where he focuses not only on the formal, but also on the text. And so I've been thinking a lot lately about landscape and how to put text inside of landscape that's text that I'm also writing. So again, this relationship between the text and the image. And I'm gonna leave it here. This is an image by Carrie Mae Weems that I've written to actually. And so I actually wanted to thank Stephen, especially for this book, The Nature of Photography, of Photographs, and also obviously for the department. But I really, 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 really love this book. And I read it quite often, and I go back to it, and it helps me to understand how to think about and open up images in relationship to text. So I'm just gonna read a bit about a photograph by Toni Morrison that I actually wrote to, and I feel like it's in line with some of the writing that Stephen did, especially in this book. Reunions transform the singular. They jet the singular forward to plural with one breath, then one step into one embrace. And in these reunions, there possess the overwhelming knowing of the wait again. Photographs contain multiple notions. They propose, announce, respond to, declare, blame, contribute, and contain desire. Photographs remain in the liminal states of seconds, moments, particular spaces, ideal memories, and longings. Thank you.
Thank you, Xaviera. Can I ask you something, Stephen? Were you the one who chose the covers for the first and second edition? Okay, not the publisher. All right. Thank you. Lucas.
So I overlapped with Xaviera at Bard. I was there in the late 90s. And I didn't study with Stephen in a class, but we worked together for my senior project. So in the spring and fall of 2001. And these meetings were sort of one-on-one meetings that happened every couple of weeks. And I would come in with a pile of photographs, and Stephen would sort of work through them with me in his office. And the project was sort of trying to culminate in a group of 30 pictures that you turned in as your sort of final project at Bard. And in my final project, I was trying to combine, I'd been, over the course of the summer, I was graduating in December. And so over the course of the sort of center summer of my project, I had gone on a big sort of looping American road trip and taken an 8x10 camera and sort of was playing in that field and had come back to upstate New York, to the Hudson Valley, and was making these sort of much more cinematic, lit, sort of staged photographs that were meant to sort of be woven into them. And so what I remember most about this experience of these meetings was how picture-focused his feedback was. Our meetings never seemed to be about how goofy the idea might or might not be, but how the picture itself might be better. How I might, in essence, make better decisions as a photographer regardless of subject matter. I remember a few weeks before my project was due, Stephen suggested that the unwieldy cinematic universe I thought I was devising could be traded in for a project about door handles in Hudson, New York. I balked, completely tied up in the implications of my own ideas. But looking back, I can see what he meant. And though I couldn't give up my content, it is clear that in many ways this much more stripped down endeavor would do just as well for the conversation he and I were having. The unit of investigation was always the picture, and critique could be measured in a picture's distance from its potential. Considering pictures this way really focused my attention on the camera as a tool for relating to or documenting the world, and simultaneously as a tool to arrange the qualities of that world onto a plane, or more to the point, to transform that world by doing so. But these activities were undergirded by photographic seeing itself, and it was better seeing that felt like the skill to be acquired. Working with Stephen directly and later reading and then teaching his book, The Nature of Photographs, this is a popular subject, I would imagine, I have come to regard the activity of photographing as a kind of problem solving. These problems are construed by a field of cultural, conventional, and structural variables, both at the level of the pictured and in the decisions made in the picture making, choice of camera, style markers, vantage points, etc. This structured consideration is something made explicit in Stephen's Uncommon Places, but also functions as a matrix for reading any photograph. As a teacher, I have found that Stephen's pedagogy and its focus on structural problem solving helps ground a generation of students who are far more accustomed to an increasingly fluid universe of images than they are to deeper encounters with pictorial art and authorship. But I don't mean to align Stephen's pedagogy against the new in any way. It is more than evident from the show next door, Stephen has consistently embraced the changing vernacular and new technologies without discarding the old. Obvious examples would be his famous turn to color in the 70s, the iBook projects of the early 2000s, and more recently, Instagram, each of which connect to a medium that is perpetually in flux. I was at Bard when the first Epson printers arrived and was one of the first batch of students to print my senior project digitally. I remember there being a lot of encouragement for this and excitement about this. But 4x5 remained a mandatory class, as it still does. And so there's this expansion of tools instead of replacement, an old and a new. Further, and very importantly to me, Stephen's picture-focused method brought into the room, even if not explicitly, a lot of thinking about how other artists had made decisions in their work. And this has the effect of connecting work not only to the present, to the subject of a given picture, but to the various histories a picture might be situated within, or in debt to. And these could include the sort of Atche-Evans lineage of the history of photography, the broader history of pictorial art, the legacies of conceptualism, pop, etc., which are all areas Stephen's own work has explored. Cultural and social histories are also near in the periphery, informing photographic decision-making in myriad ways. Stephen's description of his own work as exploring American culture begged the question of what I, as a student, was doing and how one might build on the relationships he and others had developed when taking up this problem. Over the years, I came to think a lot about the model I was using to make my work. In part, this line of thinking opened to me because Stephen has done such an excellent job of laying bare the model supporting his own. And I think it was an opening made by Stephen's methodological approach that helped give me permission to continue to locate my, at times, extra photographic work within the tradition of photography. One could even say that I grafted Stephen's problem variable description of picture making pretty directly onto a new or an expanded set of tools, as I became curious about the pictorial flexibilities the computer offered. I was and am in my own work continuing to explore the logic of the apparatus, while simultaneously trying to relate to the world in front of it. The model I have come to use is shifted so the pictures can look quite different, with the fundamental activity, to quote Stephen directly, exploring the world while exploring the medium, as well as my interest in and relationship to a contemporary vernacular has remained the same. And it is a position that I really came to first understand in that office at Bard 15 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas, and I think, Tim, you'll be next.
I've always wanted to stand in a room like this, ever since I saw Phil Donahue. Can someone out here tell me which Stephen Shore photograph they really like? Pick one that you really like it. Tell me why you like it. Somebody. Not you, someone out there. Someone out there. You like him. You like his work, right?
I really like the girl in the swimming pool and her in the swimming pool.
That's his wife. Be careful what you say. You really like. Why do you like it?
It displays a feeling, like it gives you a feeling.
What kind of a feeling? You have a feeling about his wife or in a bathing suit?
It's a feeling of like the beginning of summer. It's like opportunity and I'd speak loud enough for everybody. It's like the feeling when it's been winter and spring for a while, and now it's summer and you're first going out. It's like it's like new and fresh and freshes.
Do you think he is interested in that feeling when you look at that picture?
No, I don't know. I'm sure he didn't think of that.
Okay. What do you think he is interested in?
Now?
No, when you look at that picture, what is the artist thinking about? I wasn't here, but I know that in this room, Paul Graham once stood up and said, you know, art curators and collectors want to know what an artist did. He goes, Paul said, I don't do anything. I just point the camera thing and press a button. So what was the artist doing when he was taking that picture? What do you think?
Adjusting exposure.
Yeah.
I don't know.
All right.
Technically
Well, he might have been interested in the beginning of summer, but thank you.
You will.
I think that it's very, if you want to know what it's like to encounter Stephen as a teacher, I think you already know, because you already know what it feels like to try to understand him as an artist. Now, I propose that that is not an easy thing to do. It's easier now than it was, but I just wrote this essay in Photograph magazine that I'm not going to reprise, but I'll reprise one piece of it. I say that Stephen has been doing the opposite of what every one of you on Instagram is doing. Everyone on Instagram is going, you're gonna like my sandwich. They're gonna love my sandwich. In 1972, he's going, they're not going to be interested in my sandwich. In fact, it's going to annoy them to be forced to look at this sandwich. And also, I'm going to do it in color. And they're not interested in that. They think that's just for snapshots. And I'm going to put the camera up in this weird place with an awkward flash. And I'm going to really make a picture that feels like a camera looking at something. And I think that that is a gesture that is uncomfortable. And it's a little hard to see it in this context, right? In these hallowed halls. I think it's really important to be honest with yourself when you go through that exhibit, that the work is difficult and challenging and doesn't necessarily make it easy on you, right? So I've always really hated that picture of his of the billboard with the mountain on it. It's not a Stephen Shore picture. It's much too easy. It's much too obvious, right? So my essential message here is that you know what it's like to study with him. But is my thing on there? Where's the clicker? So I just had to call my mom and have her go in the basement to find these pictures. But what do I do? So I can't believe I'm in the Museum of Modern Art and I'm showing this work. But, whatever. Got it. You take what you can get. This is a picture I took in high school, and it's got a lot of things in it that, will happen in my work later. It's a little funny, and there's some commercial impact in it, but it's not a good picture. But here's a picture. This is the one my mother really had to dig out. I made the very first week of being a student at Bard. So, and you're kind of like, you grow up and you're living in a Cartier-Bressoonian kind of world, right? And this is what a good picture feels like, and it's energetic, and it involves your kind of effort, and you have something to say about form, and you're making these little analogies. And so wait, I go back this way. Now, how do I go backwards? Oh, a smaller one. So the very first week, I actually got into the school early. I quit early. I quit. Didn't ever graduate high school, actually. I quit. I got a job as a dishwasher, and so I could buy a car. So I could drive to Albany, in this case, and make this picture, right? So here's a picture that, it feels, you're 18, you think this is a pretty good picture. Pretty good. Funny and complicated and interesting. And I showed it to Stephen, and he said, I think you should photograph in the woods. And that, Lucas just described that moment very interestingly, of sort of like deflecting you from your assumptions. So the other thing I think it's really important to know about Stephen's work is that I think that he is interested in seeing. He's interested in looking at things. This has been said many times. But he's also interested in looking beyond the given and received formulae for how you do it, right? Knowing that we all come to making any one picture that we make with a set of assumptions about how a picture is made, a set of forms, a set of, right? Just like, right? It's in there. It's in there. You can't avoid it. You've seen it, right? There's generations of people, photojournalists, who are just making this picture over and over and over again with that same form. But Stephen is interested in challenging those things, in getting you to rethink and reimagine what that apparently thoughtless, simple act of pressing a button on a camera might imply, right? My wife is a painter, quite a good painter. She says, you're just a button pusher, right? I can make all this work. It takes her 9 months to make a painting. But the act of doing that, of saying, I'm going to make a little tiny work of art right now, and it's going to be completely done, basically finished. Not in all cases in this room is it always finished right away, but is a profoundly complicated epistemological act. Very strange. And that kind of brings me to another side of it, which I think is really interesting to think about Stephen's practice, both as a teacher and as an artist, which again I think are indistinguishable. And that has to do with, on the one hand, the completely straightforward, deadpan, whatever, straight, all these things, right? These aspects of photography that we all know, right? We all know, there's a thing over there, you press the button, and then I bring a little souvenir of that thing home, right? But I think that there's another side of it, which I think is essentially metaphysical. And that is the part where I think he believes that he knows how to translate his experience very directly through the camera, through the picture to us. Now that is a metaphysical idea. You actually cannot do that. We actually don't know what someone is thinking through a picture. We don't really know. But I think that this act of, on the one hand, this deflection, right? This sort of sense of we're being deflected away from our assumption brings us back into this moment of having to constantly reconsider what it means to press this button. I don't think it necessarily, Stephen's necessarily thinking about it in a kind of Jean Baudrillard kind of way, the implications of it. I think that he has incredible faith in it. And I think that the Bard photography program, even as it produces as many artists who don't make straight photographs as do, if not more, is a kind of cathedral of that kind of faith, right? And that faith that it means something. It means something to do it. To decide that my experience of looking at the world translated through this funny little machine onto a piece of paper is a powerful and expressive tool different in everyone's hands. So if I go, so who knows what would have happened to me? I'd probably be like a Magnum photographer right now if I had just kept going with this. Maybe that would have been better. I would have been better off at some level. But that kind of deflection, which I think is not atypical in art education, right? There's this sort of like, we make them, we remake them, and we got to change what they do. But I don't think that's what's happening here. I think there's a kind of, because it's coupled with this essential belief that our visual experience is translatable to a viewer. That doesn't necessarily sound that radical of a thing to say. But I kind of think it is. And I think that its persistence is really important. I think that, well, there's another one. God, that one is not very interesting, but there's another one. You know, I probably should move on, but there are some other things I was going to say, so I'll just fast forward through these pictures. By the way, I feel like if you really want to spend time and really understand him, this is the section of the show that you should spend the most time in. Because when you like this, you guys love this because it's the 70s, right? That's part of why you like it. But this is not the 70s. This is not the 80s, right? This is always going to be like this, even after we're all gone. Texas is probably going to look like this. But I'm just going to fast forward to some other stuff here. Photography, projects. There it is. You don't like this sandwich. You aren't going to like it. You aren't going to like it. And I'm interested in that. I want to make something that you might not like. Some percentage of art is made with that in mind, right? I want to make you a little uncomfortable with this. These are great. Everyone's up there with their cell phones photographing these things again. But I think this is a radical thing, an uncomfortable thing. So I hope you all have a very uncomfortable experience with the show.
Actually, yesterday Stephen was in the galleries, and when we got to that section, the section that you like the most, the landscape, the empty landscape, and I think you said that in fact that was a moment when you deflected the way that you were actually looking at things, because you had been an urban photographer, you were on the streets of cities primarily, and there you were now in this empty landscape, and you weren't quite sure how to look at it. Yeah. You can speak directly.
This is working? Yes. Also add that, Tim, what you were saying about translating experience into a photograph is essentially the last third of the book, of the nature of photographs.
Great, Shannon.
Okay, so I have one image here, and it's gonna look familiar to at least two of you, if not more. But this image actually hangs in my office at school, and it is a photograph of what the darkroom did look like. It does. Does it still have Kodak yellow? Okay. It's the Kodak yellow. I just, what I don't have is and you'll remember it was kind of like a archaeological relic. It was a wall that just had encrusted fixer, which was another kind of outstanding feature of the darkroom that I remember really fondly. But, and I don't even know how this photograph came into my possession, but nevertheless, I really love looking at it. So I prepared some remarks and some anecdotes, and some of these have been really touched upon already quite a bit. But yeah, for me, when I was thinking about, this forum on pedagogy, like so many of you have already said, for me, the pedagogy was really built around seeing and what we refer to now as photographic space, and really the phenomenon of the camera and its optics and how it gives form to the world. And a lot of this, as everyone has said, right, is really beautifully articulated in The Nature of Photographs, which is also a book that I teach from. And so for me, it's really photographic seeing as a visually complex endeavor. And that is definitely something that I think I've always really carried forward. So, yeah, in terms of anecdotes, I was really, I was thinking about, I was really kind of going down memory lane in a lot of ways and sort of just remembering the things that, after all these years, I still think about, and there are so many, but one in particular that still kind of puzzles me has to do with, and you'll have to tell me if I've invented this but I could swear that that you would advise to focus the 4x5 inside an object, to focus, and I know this is getting very photo nerdy, but I thought it was so fascinating that, yeah, well, here we are, okay, fine. This idea, right, that by nature the camera records what it sees, and so this idea was incredibly counterintuitive, that one would focus, but then actually shift the focus inside something that one could not see. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that maybe, in fact, you could have another chapter in the book, that if we had the physical level and the mental level and there's one more, depictive level, that you could possibly have a psychotropic level. Because kind of like what you were talking about, Tim, in terms of that room of landscapes, you know, when you're in that space and you're challenged by those images, it becomes about this kind of altered act of sort of observation and seeing and a kind of absorption in a field of vision. That, yeah, I was gonna say psychedelic, but then I thought psychotropic, a kind of altered state. I also was thinking about, again, the seriousness and rigor that so many people have already talked about, and how it was very much, this kind of work ethic was imparted generationally. I think it's quite interesting to think of the type of, the environment of Bard, and in the introduction, you were talking about this kind of liberal arts environment, and, you know, in some schools, there's this kind of tendency where the art classes can almost be like a special sauce, right? That just gets kind of poured on top of something to kind of enhance experience. But I remember this expectation that every week you were gonna photograph, every week you were gonna print, and every week for at least 3 hours you were gonna talk about work. And if you didn't have work, it was really totally unacceptable. And so, so yeah, I think that kind of attention to talking about and looking at and making photographs was something that was part of the week. It was expected that you really kind of practice this every week. You didn't just like hustle up to the critique day before the assignment was due. It's like you were really doing this thing. And I remember that being utterly overwhelming as a freshman, you know, to kind of realize that that this was, in fact, what was expected of us. Yeah, and I think, yeah, anyways, I what else? Yeah, I think when I was there, which was the same time that Tim was there, so it was kind of late 80s to early 90s, it was a different kind of cohort of faculty. And so it was Stephen Anturin, Larry Fink still, and a photo historian, Ellen Handy. But it was a very interesting kind of confluence of faculty, because Stephen, like everyone has commented, was very much about, you know, this very intensive way of seeing. Anturin was much more kind of analytical and had worked with language in her own work, and also had been an editor of Top Stories, had studied linguistics, was part of Hall Walls in Buffalo. So it was kind of this nice mix of sort of a pictures generation, you know, faculty person with, you know, Larry's kind of playing jazz music on 2 thumbs, right, in the hallway, and then Stephen, you know, which was an entirely different kind of experience. But anyways, I'm gonna close with that.
Shannon, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more, because Shannon Ebner was not following the logical path of the guru-ry of Stephen Shore. She was making thousands of Xeroxes and covering the walls and with them, and I think that there was a kind of, you know, Shannon, you went to Bard and to Yale, and Bard and Yale are connected, and it was P.L. de Corsia that called Yale the Citadel of Transparency, and they're connected in that way. So, can you talk a little bit about what it felt like to, you know, be a little punk, wheat pasting things all over the place, and in an environment like that?
Sure, yeah. And it's so funny because I had a feeling, I thought that there could be some skeletons that came out from the closet here, and I had a feeling that the Xerox thing just might actually, yeah. Yeah, I mean, no, it was, you know, I mean, I had a similar experience to what Tim was talking about in terms of, you know, encountering the kind of challenging nature of Stephen's work, and really, you know, at the I'm gonna like get back to the Xerox thing, but I remember that at first there was pretty much a kind of glorified janitor's closet where all the photo books were in the old library. I remember, you know, encountering Ed Ruscha's Every Building on the Sunset Strip. And of course your books, that's what you do. You're like, well, what does my teacher do, you know? And being just completely beguiled by this work. And graduating still not understanding Ruscha's work at all, but actually really kind of coming to a place where I understood what it was that you were looking at. And so I think that even though I did very much rebel, and I, you know, yes, I did. My senior project, every single image was Xeroxed. And yeah, for Yale, the application work was with a Brownie camera, so it only had one point of focus. And that was, but you know, I mean, like Stephen said, you know, I mean, I think that, that it still was a place where I felt like I had the freedom to express myself, and where I could go and sort of find what I needed, you know, in either within the department or within the school in general. There were so many incredible people there at the time that I could look to so many of the faculty, you know, but yeah, and so it's also been interesting, you know, to, you know, to have, to see all of the work upstairs, you know, and have a broader understanding too of the degree of sort of experimentation in your work in ways that you were so interested in different vernacular uses. So in some ways, I think it probably didn't seem so odd to you that you had this like one student, probably many more after me, that wanted to experiment a graphical nature of, you know, of imagery. So.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah.
Stephen, you have the last word.
Well, I really appreciate everything you all have said. And Shannon, I think your memory is right about focus. There's part of me that likes to have an infinitely variable device to control a picture. And this connects with what you were saying about really communicating subtle perception in a photograph. That if I am in touch with that level of perception in me, then with the view camera, I can change the focus, which you can't do with an autofocus camera, but kind of infinitely move it back and forth. You can even focus beyond infinity with the view camera until there's a point where a connection's made. Now I'm using a digital camera, and I find that I have that in sliders, in digital sliders, and that, for example, with Instagram, I use brightness and what's it called? Structure. And I move those until the image, I feel, deeply connects. So Quentin asked about how things have changed, and mentioned that the department was set up to deal with straight photography. And there's one thing that hasn't changed, which is the basic groundwork was, which I wrote out in kind of a mission statement, probably my second year at Bard, was that the aim is to, well, actually I have it written. So. A photographer's growth is the product of the simultaneous development of three interdependent factors. The first is gaining a conscious or intuitive understanding of the visual language of photography. That is how the world is translated into a photograph, and how a photograph orders in space and time the world that it shows. This is a photograph's grammar, essentially the subject of nature of photographs. The second factor is the acquisition of technique. Without a technical foundation, expression is impossible. Conversely, the broader the foundation, the greater the scope of expression. And let me add here that the basic structure of all of our classes is that the first third of the semester, some new technique is taught, 4x5, color, digital, and then the last 2/3 is integrating that into one's own work. And one thing that Quentin and I have talked about in terms of my work in the show is that the different rooms are actually marked by technological changes. Not that the view camera was a new technology, I'm going back to the oldest technology, but to go from 35 to 8x10, an aesthetic door is opened, and then the pictures then explore that, what's on the other side of that door. So this is the photograph's vocabulary. The third factor is a photographer's work on his or herself. This entails overcoming visual and psychological preconceptions and conditioning, deepening and clarifying perceptions, and opening up to one's emotions and finding one's passions. This is a photograph's content. It's the photography program's aim to offer instruction in this three-part process and to provide an historical and aesthetic framework for the student's development in the context of a liberal arts education. So that has pretty much stayed the same. But to have an educational philosophy, in a way, for me, doesn't make sense because the teaching has to take into account who the people are in the room, what age we live in, what the culture is, what the technological environment is. And so it has to be flexible. And so it's not just broadly cultural, it's the nature of the students that wind up in one school and not in another school. The students who go to Bard are different than the students who go to Yale. And so the students who come to Bard now are different from the ones who were going to Bard 30 years ago. Our culture is different. It's different. And certainly technologically we live in a very different age. And so if there is a philosophy, it's that it has to be completely flexible and take into account all these changes. Today, I run into students who are more knowledgeable about photography than ever I had in the past, who will come into class and have conversations about Jeff Wall and Terrence Simon. But they have never focused a camera. They have no idea what an f-stop is. In certain technological ways, they are more basic than the most basic student I've ever had. And so we have to change what we teach to take that into account. We spend the first 2 years doing analog, and that's a number of years ago I had an experience that kind of set that path and made it clear for me. I, for a couple of years, had a visiting professorship at an art school in Switzerland, and this was a very select group of students and very talented. And the second year, there was a problem with all the students. It was, they somehow, I think for them, it's hard to describe, but the photographs were frames around the world, but they never understood them as how they would look as a photograph. There was something missing. The pictures were smart, but there was a visceral element that wasn't there because they just weren't conceiving of it as a photographic print. And I tried to figure out why this group of 20 people have this same kind of disease. And it was none of them, I believe it's because none of them had ever been in a darkroom. This was the marginal year. There had to be 1 year. The year before, a third of them had. The year before that, half of them had. And this was the year that none of them had. And I think there's something that's learned by making this process physical, by your whole body is involved in it. You make a print, you take it into the light, you think this is a little too light, and you go back and you change the timer, and you do a little burning in, and you make another print, and you look at that, and it involves your whole being, and that's different than playing with those sliders that I like so much now. But to know what to do with them, those sliders in Photoshop, I think has to be learned in this more traditional way. One other thing that, I think the rest of you are talking more philosophically, and I'm going to talk kind of nuts and bolts, which is one of the things also that I'm interested in with the program is we have lots of cameras, and just as I've mentioned, the doors opened by different technologies, we want our students to experience that. So we have enough cameras to give every student in the department their own camera for a semester, from 35 millimeter. Now we in the past 2 years, we bought probably 50 35 millimeter cameras, because the only really decent 35 millimeter film camera you can buy now is a Leica, which is a lot to ask of a student. The second year, all of our students use 4x5, not 4x5s to everyone for the whole semester. All our color students shoot medium format. We have enough Mamiya 7s to give them each a Mamiya 7 for the semester, or a Rolleiflex if they want rather have that. And we have 8x10 cameras. This sounds like a very kind of unimportant thing, but I think it's very important for them to experiment in that. And I see people's minds opening. One last thing. One class I would be very hesitant to give up is the view camera class, because for me it's the single most pivotal class. And even if none of the students ever pick up a view camera again, even if they do the rest of their photography with an iPhone, it's the class which turns seeing into something conscious. It makes it a conscious activity. And once that happens, no matter what camera you use, your pictures are filled with the presence of conscious attention. And that has a resonance that's there when I see a good iPhone picture. Thank you.
I'm sure that everyone here has questions for Stephen or among yourselves, but I would like first just to ask around the room if there is any burning kind of question, comment, as we like always to involve everyone, all the participants here. So raise your hand, a mic will be given to you. Mike, is there a mic around there?
Hello? Hello. Good evening. I really like this last moment, Stephen, so I follow what you just said about the view camera and the image upside down and right, left. And the dark room as well makes me think a lot about the place of where there is water and when there is this sort of minerals and this sort of archaic elements of photography. And there is a connection there, and it's what you said about also coming to consciousness from darkness, coming to see the print and coming to learn the consciousness also seems something similar to going to an analyst, for example, and learning a dream, or the dream of photography has changed so fast that now we don't know perhaps how to read this world. And I don't know, I like this, what you said made me think these things, that's all. I'm done, so.
Svetlana.
I just want to ask a question which I thought Quentin was asking you at the beginning. How do we get from you as self-taught? I was going to offer Walker Evans, who said, as far as he thought being self-taught was the way true photography was produced, except maybe you needed a mentor. And of course, he did have a mentor for a short time. How did we get from self-taughtness, which is you and also Evans, to a situation where all photography is being taught and everybody has to study it? Could you
Sure.
explain that?
I have two answers. First, I did have a mentor who was John Sharkowski. And I first showed him work when I was 21, 22, before my show at the Met, and continued. We had a relationship that continued until he passed away. The second answer is that I think a good teacher has to have a sense of it as a guide, and I see myself as a guide, which, as a slight digression, I would say, doesn't mean I'm a better person than the student. It means I've gone down a path that the student hasn't gone down yet, and I could help them. If I'm a fly fisherman and I encounter a new river, I always hire a guide because they know the river. And to be a guide, it means you have to have a sense of what someone needs to discover on their own and what they can be led to. And sometimes it means, we've heard a number of cases where I'm telling people, stop doing that, try something else. But there are other times that I let people come to a dead end. So it's that kind of judicious, intuitive sense of what a particular person needs.
What do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that there's photographic education?
Are you addressing me?
Yeah, what do you
Well,
think?
look, I come from the history of painting, and I had sort of, and I'm now working on Walker Evans, so I'm sort of jumping from one thing to something that's quite new for me. And the reason I asked it is because my assumption has been, and it has certainly been the assumption in the Western tradition, that painters, you couldn't just pick up a paintbrush and go crazy, as for example, think he was going crazy, as for example, Walker Evans said to Kirstein in 1930, I thought I would go crazy. In a day, he's running around with a camera, and my God, he's making extremely good photographs within kind of a year of 1928, even 28. You could not do that in painting. So I would assume that a painter needed an education, and that there were examples of photographers, you at 14 or Walker Evans at 20 whatever, who didn't have to be trained to pick up a camera and do something. So now I'm saying, if that's the case, why is there now such a complex array of educational institutions teaching photography?
Well,
that was my question.
One thing you're alluding to is that photography is probably the easiest medium to produce a work in. Tim talked about producing a complete work. When you take a picture, there's a camera that I was once fascinated by called a CAT cam, made in Germany. It's a very lightweight digital camera that takes a picture once every minute or once every 2 minutes, and you put it on a pet's collar. And as they go through a day, pictures are taken. And in every formal way, they are complete pictures. The exposure is fine, the focus is fine, it has content, it has 4 edges, it has a picture plane, it has a vantage point. It is in every formal way as complete as a picture any of us would take. But so that's where the lack of training allows for a photographer to pick up a camera and do it. But hidden in that is that kind of masked by the ease is the visual language that was my concern with nature photographs. That you can take a picture that is formally complete, but in a certain way is illiterate.
But nevertheless, there are people such as yourself or Evans who really, he did have Steiner, but
Yes.
basically he just began to photograph. And so there are, you know, special people, you or Evans, who could do that without going to Bard.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But I think, Stephen, you have mentioned, in fact, whether it's a formal education or is someone who picks up the camera and tries every single thing that you can do with it, eventually you will end up with an education, right?
If you have an analytic mind.
Well,
I
obviously,
mean, there's some people who
Right.
may take a picture and not
someone who
think
will
about what can I learn from it.
well, someone who will try every possibility that particular apparatus,
Yes, yes.
right, offers to you, I think has, by de facto, right, an analytical mind. That's the reason why they would try everything, otherwise they wouldn't. And in fact, you had a class you mentioned to me, which was called Master Class, and maybe you can talk a little bit about it, because it was for 10 years at Bard, where there wasn't really a curriculum per se. It wasn't taken for credit. A number of very interesting, people who became photography collectors, who became publishers of photographic books, and who became artists took that class. And it didn't have the strict format of the classroom or that teaching, but they were coming on a one-on-one kind of showing the work, maybe as you would have shown it to John Sharkovsky or someone else.
That was exactly the model.
Right.
That's what I was thinking about, that I think I was very fortunate to come into photography in the era that I did, because it was at a time when I could, as a young man, call up Sharkovsky and make an appointment, because I didn't have a lot to do during the day. There weren't that many photographers, and I don't think the opportunity, well, I'm not saying even with you, Quentin, but by the end of the 70s, John couldn't do that. Between the beginning of the 70s and the end of the 70s, the demands on his time multiplied geometrically. And so that it means that students, when they graduate, don't have a lot of avenues for feedback. And so I was thinking about my relationship with him, where whenever I had a new body of work, I would bring it. And I was thinking about, I was a friend of the Beschers and how they taught, where, again, whenever someone had a new body of work, they didn't have weekly classes. They might see students once every few months. And both situations had a couple of things in common, which is neither they nor John put any pressure on us to do work. It's essential that no credit was given, and at the Kunstakademie, there was no credit.
There isn't it to today.
No, and that's, I think, essential, that there can't be this contract with credit where if you don't do work, then I'm going to fail you, because at a certain point you have to be self-motivated. And so I wanted to kind of create a program like that where there's no credit and people come, and not weekly, but could be every few months, and get a critique. And there are at least one, if not more, people in the room who participated, like George Miles over there, and Kai, and so that's the program.
Now, can I ask you, because you mentioned the Beschers and Quentin mentioned the internationalization, of photography in a different context. He was thinking more about now and your teaching. But I think that the transatlantic relationship that that you had with the Beshers, whom you have met in '73, right, at Sonnabend, when they had their first solo exhibition?
No, actually,
Not their first, but
no. I met
it
them.
was-
I met them through Weston Net. I met Hilla.
Okay.
I didn't meet Bernd until
Later.
much later, because he was never really comfortable with English and didn't travel here as much as she did.
Mhm.
And she was spending a lot of time in New York.
Right.
And she was a friend of Weston's, and we met in '73 and became friends.
But that was the year when they also had a show at Sonnabend. I thought you
Yeah.
met at Sonnabend. Anyway, so in '73 you met them here, then in '76 he started teaching at the Staatliche Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf. He presented your work to their students. And what I was interested is also, and that was happening in Düsseldorf, but at the same time in Berlin, Michael Schmidt started the Werkstatt für Photography, and that was a very active space for workshops and for exhibitions, and many people, and Eggleston and you and Louis Baltz and so many others, right, Larry Clark, went there and had shows. And I wonder whether you can speak a little bit about this bifurcated relationship with Germany between Berlin and Düsseldorf.
I don't have any particular insight into it. I had a show at the Werkstatt, but I didn't meet Michel until much later, until the '90s. And so I had no really real relationship with him, while I had a real ongoing relationship with particularly Hilla. And I hadn't been to Germany until Heinz Liesbruck and Thomas Vesky organized a show of my work that traveled to a number of cities, and then traveled around and tried to meet as many of the photographers as I could, and met Schmidt and Appelt and Joachim Brum and all the Düsseldorf people.
But so I was interested
And
again.
and actually did had a wonderful evening. Did a class with Bernd Hiller students at the Kunstakademie. They all cooked a wonderful dinner and were up all night talking about pictures.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Two questions. First one, where was that crazy picture of you that Quentin was talking about taking? Because it's not Bard College. We were sitting there.
It was Bard College.
It was.
It was at CCS.
Oh, right, yeah, right, gotcha, okay. It looked like a Korean mall. But, so my question has to do with.
It was a more photogenic room than our classroom.
My question to you, and I think this is a little bit connected to some things that have been burbling around here. You know, we're sort of talking about, you know, why would you teach? What does it mean to teach photography in a world where, you know, innovations are made throughout the history of photography by vernacular practitioners, right? As a kind of John Sharkowski's whole shtick is the vernacular, is the innovation, and artists kind of follow. But, and obviously we're living in a world, you're about to teach a class on Instagram, and we're living in a world where everyone has a photographic practice, and many people in this room have two. They have like a kind of serious one, and then they have a kind of pocket one. So the world is changing. Oh my God, I'm sure there's been 1,000 uninteresting discussions in this room about it already, about that topic. So my question though for you is, if we're going to kind of go back to that time when you're saying there just aren't that many photographers, I can walk into John Sharkowski's office, and you know, being a Warholian person, right? So making work that's a little blank, a little challenging to people. And then to have lived through this moment where people accept you, right? I mean, you had shows early on that were not accepted at all. So that there are, you know, like Hollywood films that are just using your pictures as a reference for an entire, you know, design of a film. How does that feel?
Cool.
I have a question, and it's kind of a fundamental question. I'm really interested if you could expand on what photographic language is. I'm a painter, I come out of painting, and it seems to me that painting really is a language because they're smaller units that things are put together with, and more complicated things are assembled, things are divided, multiplied. But my attraction to photography is that I see it as fundamentally not linguistic, or maybe just everything is linguistic, but being able to open this little room to the world and to use it as a type of filter seems quite different from at least what I understand languages. But I would love to hear what you...
Yes, I would say you're exactly right. I don't think that means photography doesn't have its language, but it is in many ways the opposite language of painting. And this is something that I first thought about because of something that Sharkowski wrote. He wrote an article for the New York Times Magazine called A Different Kind of Art, where he talks about painting being essentially a synthetic medium and photography being essentially an analytic medium. And a painter starts with a blank piece of paper or a blank canvas, and every mark adds complexity. Photographer starts the opposite. They start with the whole world and make selections and place order on it. And so it's a different language. Painting is a synthetic language and photography is an analytic language. And what I talk about in Nature of Photographs are the elements of that analytic language.
So I just follow up what is the techniques of placing order on the world? That's considered framing, it's considered catching the time, the light, etc.?
I would say 4 basic ones and some other minor ones, but the 4 basic ones are the choice of vantage point, the choice of framing, the moment to take the picture and the time duration, and the plane of focus. And these are the basic tools that we use to place order on the world.
Okay, thank you very much. That's
Is this on still? It is, yeah? Oh, yeah. I was wondering if there's any Eastern philosophy or Eastern practice or meditation practice that's behind the work. Not just because of a lot of things that have already been discussed here that have to do with, these kinds of perceptual observations and these sorts of, everything that's been described around looking. But I'm also thinking about, you were just kind of touching on some ideas that are in that unpublished, like 4-page text that you wrote, Form and Pressure. And at the end of that, you have some kind of Eastern proverb. I don't know if it's Indian.
It's just a few lines from a Persian poet.
Yeah. Maybe you can talk about that because it this thing about the light, right? That you can't see the dust without the light, but then without the light, that the light gives the dust form. It's not
Yeah.
quite getting that exactly.
Yeah, and I
I'm
don't want to
paraphrasing,
paraphrase
but-
it because I don't want to mess up the
I did
the
that
line.
for you, so
But,
you can.
but it was a poet named Shabastari who is relating form to content. And he does it by talking about, imagine a speck of dust in a beam of light. You can't see the light without the dust, nor can you see the dust without the light. And he, it's not that I'm talking about it in terms of form and content. This is specifically what he's writing about. But I'm going to answer more that's behind your question. So you and I both teach, is your program in a liberal arts college at the university? So we're both teaching a liberal arts college, and our students are not all going to be photographers. And I think about what can I impart to someone who doesn't really have an intention to be a photographer. And I think it's what I talked about with the view camera. It's seeing with conscious attention. And I think going through a day and seeing with conscious attention and self-awareness that you're aware of yourself experiencing the seeing has almost a chemical effect in people. That it may not be a meditative practice, but maybe it is. In a certain way, it's not cutting yourself off from the world to experience it, it's doing it in the midst of the world. And as I'm saying this, I think about a few lines from Shakespeare that have been on my mind for 50 years. And it's a scene from Merchant of Venice. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls, but whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. And so I think what Shakespeare is suggesting is that there's some kind of deep harmony in us, but that somehow, through the experiences of our early experiences of our lives, it gets encrusted and covered over. And some people may think it's their duty to themselves to scour that incrustation away. And I think that that's seeing what I'm calling seeing with conscious attention and self-awareness is one way of doing that. And it's the way photographers may learn to do that.
Can I add something? I got asked to teach a class next summer at the Omega Institute. This is a spiritual center. I do not consider myself a spiritual man. I am not only an atheist, I'm an anti-theist. And I was really surprised that they asked me. But then I thought about it, and I had this moment, and I realized that, you know, photographers never kill themselves. There's only 3 that I can think of in the whole history of photography who have killed themselves. Poets are always killing themselves. They're just every minute of the day, of every moment, a poet kills himself. And I think that there's a reason for that. And I think it's that, you know, I don't know, when I once tried yoga in 1994, and they said, look inside yourself and know there are peace. And I just heard a hello. There's nothing in there. But I know that through photography, I'm connected to the outer world. My inner life is tethered to the outer world through the practice of doing it. I think that that is incredibly, incredibly healthy. So I'm teaching this class that's going to be called photosensitivity. And it's about how to feel, how to connect your inner life to your outer life, how to feel something through the camera.
Can I just add? Well, I'm just gonna go off on this just because I don't know if I'm the only one on this panel, but I actually grew up Buddhist, and I grew up and I lived with monks, and so for me, working with a view camera is very much like having a spiritual practice, because, and it's also when I teach students, I try to get them to slow down by working with film, and because everyone is loving their iPhones, which is fabulous, but I always try to get them to slow down, and I really want them to have had experience in the darkroom, because I want them to breathe, because as Stephen is saying, it brings your consciousness to the forefront and things become more vivid. And I think especially with the view camera, there's so much you have to do in order to make an image happen, and all of that. It's actually a physiological thing, and it's very similar to sitting down and meditating or walking, which is a way that I've lived for many years in meditation. So for me, I really equate it to it's a spiritual act in a way. I mean, whatever kind of spiritual or anti-spiritual, but in terms of teaching students, I think it's really helpful to get them to breathe, which is a fundamental practice of meditation and yoga or prayer.
Over here and then.
Hi. Greetings. Before I ask my question, I had to mention the discussion of light falling on dust in order to make it visible was just great. And I wonder if we can all think about the eclipse that just happened recently and all the miracles of optics we might have witnessed then. So anyway, but my question has to do with your point about developing as a photographer, as an artist, whether you've studied it or not. And I think it's an interesting one, and I have a question I want to direct to you. I myself didn't study photography, so the studying of it and the education didn't get in my way, but I also missed some kind of learning that I might have had. And so it has to do with an attitude about teaching where you obviously want to inspire rigor in your students, but about directing rigor towards yourself so that you don't get in the way of students as they might develop because of your own preconceptions about what photography could be.
So your question is, how do you avoid your own preconceptions?
Right, when you teach.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And some people avoid it more than others.
Yeah,
but I would say that having that in one's mind, that for years, I never ever showed a student a single picture of mine. And I would assume there are people like Shannon who snuck off to the library, but I never talked about my work because I felt like they're probably being influenced enough just by my point of view on photography. I don't want them to produce work that looks like mine. So someone can make a conscious effort to be open to students with lots of creative energy who want to make Xeroxes.
I just wanted to say that that there's these performances that Greg Bordowitz has been doing that are called testing some beliefs, where he basically just stands up in a room and tries to kind of move through a number of held beliefs that he has, to test them. And if you have an opportunity, I haven't. There's maybe just one posted on YouTube. But I would say that for me, teaching is a lot about testing one's beliefs, testing one's disbeliefs, undoing beliefs. It's really a kind of living organism that is constantly being challenged and tested, really, you know, yeah, by students.
I have a kind of prosaic question for the students on the panel. Because two kinds of technology have come up in your discussion. And one are, you know, the technologies that make up the apparatus of photography. But the other technology that kept on coming up was the car, right? Both Tim, Lucas, you brought it up explicitly. And you know, I went to a small liberal arts college as well, and it was kind of a running joke how with the photo class, if you were a liberal arts college that was in the middle of nowhere, that in the photo class, there were just only so many occasions on campus that you could photograph, right? There were only so many objects of study. And I guess because there's such a ethos of for photography, of getting in the car, of discovering America, and there's a way in which there was a kind of bashfulness, particularly for you, Lucas, about the way you discussed like what the car meant for you. I'm curious, and I want, you know, let's connect this to the pedagogy. I'm curious, is getting in the car as a photographer of a certain age, is that the equivalent of like artists of a certain age having the phase where they painted like de Kooning, that they worked through, right? Or particularly in a place like Bard, you know, where if you don't have a car, you're kind of stuck in Tivoli. You know, what's the relationship between mobility and pedagogy, right? Actually your training and teaching, or you know, your training and like how you actually completed assignments, you know, in the locale of Bard photography.
Although you're asking the students,
Yeah.
I'll throw in my 2 cents, which is, I think you're raising a very interesting question, and I've looked into my department buying a car to give to students. But it turns out the insurance issues just become staggering. But we do have a couple of zip cars on campus.
Can I ask a question? As the nature of perception. Are we done with cars? Oh,
I don't know if anyone else wanted to answer the question about.
I mean, I feel like I like the de Kooning analogy. I mean, it was you know, I was shooting at the time with a large format camera, and it's a cumbersome thing. I mean, I really found that my time driving around and photographing, the trick was actually to get out of the car a lot. You know, like it's easy to sort of stay in the car and wander around the Hudson Valley. But I mean, it was more for me. The car sort of left my life at a time when I moved here and just didn't have access to one in general. So I don't know if it felt like a shedding of the skin at the time, but it sort of probably has been in a way.
Can I say one quick thing about it? So I think it's really important to know that this is a campus that doesn't even have a town. It isn't even in Tivoli. It's in the middle of nowhere. And part of the reason that Stephen's practice works so well is that there is often nothing to photograph. And people learn how to photograph it, right? So there's a poet that's also taught at Bard since 1961 named Robert Kelly, and he said, here's a story that says, I never had anything to say, but I knew how to say it. And I think that it connects again to Stephen's own practice, where I don't think he's thinking about the content much. Don't think it matters that much to him. I don't think he's thinking about summertime, the feeling of summertime. I don't even think he's really thinking about his wife in a bikini that much. I think he's thinking about what this thing looks like and how to translate it to you. But that is a fascinating thing. If you are forced to photograph nothing, what do? How do you make something interesting out of nothing? And I think all of these people at this table have been stuck doing that and had to come up with strategies to do it. So then when you get in front of the content, you know what to do with it.
It's on. Okay.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mare, go.
heard somebody say a while ago that the photograph is the photographer's experience, which may be a little more complicated than it sounds literally. But I have become interested recently in the idea of photographs, even straight photographs that don't point back to the photographer. And so I was interested to hear that said. And I mean, for example, I wonder if that is what was said, if we could say that Robert Frank's photographs are Robert Frank's experience. I'm trying to think of straight photographers. Or LaToya Ruby Fraser's photographs are her experiences. But also Walker Evans, it would have been very perhaps alarming, but also fascinating to see records of his going crazy. We don't usually think of him that way, but yeah, but it didn't show up in the photographs. Yes. Anyway,
you guys can take this out.
Yeah, we'll take it outside. But what I wanted to pursue about Evans was that besides saying that he thought he was going crazy, he said memorably, "There's a wonderful secret. Sometimes I feel there's a wonderful secret in this place, a marvelous secret in this place, and only I can capture it, and only at this time." And that is, I think, a different order of experience. And perhaps it's one that's related to this whole question of how you develop as a photographer if somebody isn't your teacher. What does it mean to pursue that secret? And also related to that question, I mean, especially with Evans, I mean, I think that it's not difficult for anybody, anyway, practicing an art or a skill, I mean, you're aware of a field of possibilities, and perhaps that was the secret he was referring to. You always have, if you can imagine what's possible, then you have all kinds of self-created aspirations and goals and possibilities. So those are, I'm interested in the idea of the photographer's experience, if that was what was said, but also these other views that were brought up. Thank you.
Can I just tag along this as we speak about experience? The name of Minor White came up at the beginning of this forum, and I'm curious to ask Stephen about your experience with Minor White, as we are talking about the nature of perception and Eastern philosophies. Minor White,
Yes.
what is his place in your story? I'd like to know more about that.
In 1970, I did a 10-day workshop with him. I continued to show him work a bit into the 70s. He never really had any interest in what I was doing. I think there was sort of that we were heading in different trajectories, and that I thought he didn't get that seeing something and communicating what the world looks like with heightened attention was very close to his own goals, and that he didn't see that, and that he was very tied to symbols. And I think that, and I wasn't.
I wanted to also just jump in. This is actually back to the prior question and some other questions that have to do with thinking about, self-taught versus schooled. And I feel like a lot of what's been, this kind of lineage that we've been kind of hanging around in here has been more of a kind of paternal order, I would say. That's kind of the Walker Evans, Sarkowski, Steichen model. And that's, completely within a particular context, right? And that's also been described here in terms of there were fewer artists, there were fewer photographers, there were fewer outlets for exhibiting work, there were almost no publications, etc. Those were the terms and conditions of that time. But I think other models that one might think of is, you know, to think of, you know, even a figure like Sarah Charlesworth, who was also self-taught, but really had the benefit of, you know, being in a kind of impoverished New York City with a bunch of kind of ratty intellectuals, you know, that had migrated over from the West Coast or from Buffalo, and, you know, having these kinds of these groups, these sorts of reading groups, or making their own, you know, experimental galleries, and kind of creating their own environments in which to create discourse and discursivity. And I think that it's really interesting to think about that right now in this kind of Instagram, you know, photographic universe, this kind of Flusserian moment of kind of endlessly repeating images and a kind of affirmation culture, right? And to think back, really, I think one of the main things about educating right now is how to figure out how to kind of help students along in terms of, you know, that affirmation is not necessarily, right? That a kind of unknown public is not necessarily a forum. So I'm kind of stringing together all sorts of ideas here. Maybe they don't all completely connect, but I just thought it was important to kind of, you know, give a shout out to these other models that have been incredibly effective for unschooled, untrained, curious, rigorous, intellectual artists. So, yeah.
And I think with that in mind, one change at Bard since you left is we now have a senior seminar where the seniors get together every week and discuss each other's work. And at first, actually, there was no professor. It was trying to set up a situation, a model that could continue after graduation.
Right. Yeah. No. Peer review. Exactly. Yeah.
And if Tim wants to talk more about it, because now Tim is running that.
I'm happy to not show up and just have them. One thing you all should know is that we used to have a softball team. This is my one anecdote. Now, 1839 is a very important date. It's the year, of course, that baseball was invented, and photography. Neither were really invented then, but that is the year that both are purportedly invented. So these two incredibly important things. So we had a photo department softball team, and everyone had to have a name of a photographer on their back. And Stephen played, and he was Eugene Adje. Just thought you should know that.
There is also a department T-shirt that you made during my time, right? This might be another skeleton that said "Bard Photography, no excuse for creativity," and you found it as funny as you do now. Yeah. Where did that come from?
It just popped into my head. I have no idea where. I'm not even sure what it means.
Well, it's funny because there's a real prankster element in the show, right? I mean, there's those kind of Xeroxes that you were handing out, you know, outside a movie theater, falsely advertising something, and so yeah. Now I really appreciate the T-shirt because it was that kind of like jokestery side that maybe we didn't always see so much of.
I think we came to the end of our 2 hours, and obviously this is a community here that has a lot to share. I want to actually thank to the larger community in the room who is coming to the forums, and I would like to congratulate Stephen and Quentin and Kristen for this extraordinary exhibition. Thank you.